Well, I think our speakers really don't need presentation. I'm not going to follow the traditional way to introduce each speakers because this conference, by its own nature, is different because we're going to talk about our own research and teaching interest in the course of the next few minutes. It gives me great pleasure and absolutely honored to be chairing the first panel. That was going to be chaired by my colleague Elaine Debras here from the University of Manchester. Unfortunately, Elaine won't be able to be with us today, and I'm replacing her. And in this panel, we have Professor David Feldman, Professor Don Oliver, Professor Robert Thomas, and Professor Rodney Brazier. Then, as I said earlier on, each speaker has approximately 8 to 10 minutes for their presentations, and immediately after, we'll have the discussion. Then, Dawn, the floor is yours.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Javier. And can I, without being boring, I'm sure, just say how grateful I am, and I'm sure we all are, to be invited to this conference. I mean, it's not often that you get many, let alone this many, public lawyers together talking about teaching, which is a large part of what we do about teaching our subject. So special thanks, obviously, to Javier and to Robert for organising this. Now, in this panel, we were given, I think, 8 sort of bullet point topics to share out between us. And I'm going to be talking about what is exactly public law and interdisciplinary nature of public law, political science, history, sociology, etc. Now, I think the question, what exactly is public law, and I was right when I guessed this, is the sort of question that someone from a civil law jurisdiction would ask. And it was Javier's question. I mean, it's a jolly good question.
Shame on me.
Well, it's a jolly good question, but I'm not sure that we really need to answer it. And that's because we're common lawyers, and there isn't really, and I don't want to enter into this argument now, but I don't think there really is much of a division between public and private law. I mean, there are some differences, but now, if we had a written constitution, it might have the phrase public law in it. I mean, it very well might not, but if it did, we would probably have a lot of case law on what it meant. But we haven't got a written constitution with that phrase in it. We do have some statutory provisions. We've got, obviously, functions of a public nature in the Human Rights Act, and then we've got the non-statutory concept of public functions in judicial review. Are they the same? Are they different? I mean, that's a wonderful thing to discuss. You could take forever on it. We've got public authorities. What are public authorities? So you do get, particularly in recent statutes, you do get use of the word public or public authorities. And of course, we all know that it's causing the courts a lot of difficulty interpreting what does it mean. So it's a really interesting thing to explore, but I don't think we need, and I'm certainly not capable of formulating at all a precise definition of public or public law. But of course, we're talking about teaching, and you can't teach legal topics in alphabetical order. I mean, you can't start with what begins with A and then go on to something that begins with B and C. So we do sort our curriculum into broad topics. And when I learnt law, which was millions of years ago, we didn't call it public law, we called it constitutional and administrative law. And we weren't very precise about what that was either, actually. But anyway, the whole idea of public law was relatively recently. And of course, when you're when you're as old as I am recently, it goes back quite a long way. Anyway, get introduced. So we feel we need to, and the qualifying law degree provisions require us to teach what we roughly know is public law or constitutional or administrative law, and contract and tort and criminal law and all the rest. And so I think what we do, most of us do, is take a pretty pragmatic approach. And again, it would be risky for me to produce a definition that people could argue about, but it's roughly about the law, and I think it includes the hard and the soft law, relating to the powers of and relationships between state institutions and relationships between state institutions and individuals and other bodies, other legal institutions. Now, of course, that does raise a whole lot of wonderfully interesting topics, subtopics. I mean, I talked about the law relating to the powers of state institutions. Now, state, I mean, we don't have a concept of state. So you can have a lovely time trying to explain to the students, if you can keep their interest when they're first years, about, you know, what we've got instead of a state, which a lot of other countries do have. And, of course, having to look at hard and soft law is interesting. And we all know that if you taught, let's call it public law, without mentioning conventions, people would get a quite extraordinary impression of what our system was all about. And of course, there's a lot of other soft law around as well. And if we're talking about state institutions, we also, and I think Geraint Howes mentioned this, we need to take on board that there are a whole lot of very complex and interesting and rather ambiguous relationships between private bodies, and let's not try and define private either, and public bodies, public-private partnerships, and so on. So I think what the students would get out of this after, that is, unless they decide to change their law degree subject, is that there is an awful lot of sort of ambiguity. Mystery, I think, was a very good word that Mark Elliott used recently about the British Constitution in all of this. So, and of course that raises issues, and this is where I have a little view, but I don't want to go into it in too much thing. You know, why, what differences are there between a lot of state bodies and other bodies? And I think it's really this, it's a cultural, a traditional, a historical, to an extent a political understanding that some bodies ought to be acting, if you like, altruistically, in good faith, to do their best to promote what's in the interests of the whole country and the whole community, the sort of public interest and public service principles. And that takes us into accountability. So can you be sure, and how sure can you be, and how can you be sure that these institutions are actually acting in good faith, doing their best for the general country as a whole? And it seems to me that obviously gets us into democracy. Democracy is supposed to be making sure that governments and so on do that sort of thing and not other things. And you then get into other forms of accountability, and sometimes accountability is rather negative and is to the wrong people for the wrong things, and you get bad government. Well, I'll move on now. Those are just some, as you can see, some scatterbrained thoughts, really. Interdisciplinarity and the teaching of public law is the other ballpoint I said that I would talk something about. Now, I think I'd be very surprised if anyone here disagreed with the idea that disciplinarity is definitely important for people researching in public law. And when I come to look at why it might be important in teaching, then there will be some of the same reasons. But the problem we've got, if we think that interdisciplinarity in teaching is a good thing, is that public law is an enormous topic, and it's difficult enough to teach the law and look at the sort of very legal concepts in the time available, particularly if there's basically a one-year public law course. And so it's difficult to get interdisciplinarity into the teaching, but I still think it's worthwhile if one can possibly manage it. But why would interdisciplinarity be a good thing? Well, firstly, I think a purely, if you like, analytical approach gives a very misleading impression of the realities of the working of our constitutional system and of administrative law, judicial review, and all of that. And you don't want to give students a misleading impression. So there are various other disciplines that can play a part or come into our teaching, which should reduce the misleadingness and also, which I think is very important, to give students some insights and understanding into how the system actually works, or how people think it ought to work, or how people think it works when it doesn't, and so on. Well, the obvious other and very, very closely related subject, I think, is history. And much of what is taught in public law courses can only be understood in anything other than a superficial sense by having a look at the history of the system. And that means, apart from other things, if you're going to look at, and I'm sure most of us try to do this if we can fit it in, something about Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, the Act of Succession, Acts of Union, and so on, which were largely the product of the political history of the United Kingdom. So, and I don't think it's difficult to weave history into the teaching, because if you're going to teach things in roughly chronological order, or bits and pieces in chronological order, you will find you're trying to do a bit of history as well. And of course, many of our leading cases, absolutely fundamental cases, the case of proclamations, the case of prohibitions, Entercon, Carrington, and so on, are very good illustrations of the development or the history of our constitution. And of course, and this is where our students students in a common law jurisdiction are so fortunate, because they've all got stories attached to them. And if, like me, you have difficulty with pure abstraction, you know, I could never have done language problems also, but I could never have read or succeeded in a law degree in Spain or Germany or France, because I don't do that sort of completely abstract sort of reasoning. So I think the history is not difficult to weave in, but of course it's a question of time. But there are other disciplines as well. I mean, obviously philosophy and jurisprudence, the meanings of law. Well, you know, why isn't a convention a law? Why is an act of parliament a law? Why isn't all of that, which is absolutely wonderful. What are rights? What are the rationales for rights? And so on. So one immediately gets into a very rich academic discipline there. Politics, of course, very related to history, but current politics also. If the students, if you can weave into the teaching of public law an awareness of what's going on now, currently in politics, and what has been going on, however far back you feel able to go, it's important that students recognize, I think, that wonderful ideas like let's protect human rights don't just come from a whole lot of altruistic politicians who one day have a bright idea. I mean, there is a political background to it often, and I think looking at politics helps to understand that. And also, I've got very interested recently in what I call constitutional moments. Suddenly, Parliament will think, my God, we've got to do something about MPs' expenses. Let's pass the, whatever it's called, the IPSA Act. Well, I mean, that was the product of, I mean, everyone knew there was a problem for years and years and years, but you had to have a crisis in order to make something happen. Of course, what happens isn't always the right thing, but that helps. Now, another field which I happen to think is very important is, I'm afraid, anthropology, evolutionary biology, psychology, behavioral sciences, and so on. I think you can get immense insights into how a political system works from those. But obviously, especially if you've only got 1 year, or if you're very, very lucky 2 years in which to teach public law, you can't do all of this. You can't do history, or you can't get the students to do history, philosophy, jurisprudence, politics, anthropology, and, you know, sociology and economics and so on. So I suppose the question is, well, what's the point of doing it? Well, a point, if you could do it all, would be that the students would then come away with a quite rich understanding of what public law is about and how it works and why it doesn't work and all of that. But of course you can't do that. But I think what you can do by inserting as much as you want to into the course is give students an awareness of the fact that there are many different ways of interpreting or looking at a legal topic, a legal subject, public law in this case. They need to be aware that there are people from other disciplines who can bring insights to what they're doing, that the sort of traditional lawyer's way of looking at things, well, there aren't many traditional lawyers around now, but anyway, sort of, let's call it the traditional way, leaves an awful lot of questions unanswered, and students need to know there are an awful lot of unanswered questions around. They also need to know, but this is not really relevant to what I'm saying. They also need to know that there aren't actually right answers to an awful lot of the questions they're asked. So really, those are my views about what is exactly public law and interdisciplinarity in public law teaching. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, David.
Thank you. Well, great privilege to be here, and like everyone else, I'm very grateful to Javier and Robert for organising it all. I'm the worst person to talk about teaching-related matters because I am not a good teacher. One of my students last year in the questionnaire returns on lectures said his lectures were worse than useless. He is an inept public speaker, so he wasted my time. So I approach this with a proper sense of the temerity of what I'm doing here. And the other thing that I should say at the outset is that I come to this, as I suspect most, if not all of us do, in the aftermath of that very sobering experience of examining. And it's wonderful when you get to the end of a year of pedagogical effort, and that's the first time I've ever managed to say that. I'm not effort, but we get to the end of a year of this effort and realise just how much of it has been misinterpreted, misconstrued, misunderstood. So it sharpens one's mind when it comes to looking at this sort of thing. My brief this morning is to talk about the relationship between the national and the international in public law. And one can sum up the problem as follows. How do we get people, young people usually, who know nothing about constitutions, nothing about law, very little about international affairs, to understand that constitutions, including ours, aren't hermetically sealed, that they run into each other and that they run into and are influenced by what happens outside, whether it's international law, EU law, or indeed what is increasingly called the international community, which I always think is one of those ironic things that you should put community in quotation marks. And it's very difficult because typically we start by looking at what's out there from the perspective of what's in here. We start by teaching constitutional fundamentals, constitutional basics, institutions, and they learn about parliamentary sovereignty. They then get introduced to the EU, typically from the perspective of something that may have the effect of limiting parliamentary sovereignty. Well, frankly, if that's the case, then that's the very last thing that was in the minds of the people who established the EU. Similarly, one may come across the UN in the context of UN Security Council resolutions under Chapter 7 of the Charter to combat, for example, terrorism. Again, is this an infringement of parliamentary sovereignty? How does it relate to embedded concepts of domestic law? Now, it occurred to me while I was marking a whole lot of constitutional law scripts that we might get a better understanding of the interrelationships and also of the substance of these different systems if instead of looking out from the inside, we looked in from the outside. And we started off by thinking about the international community and about the role of the UK within it. One could then move steadily downwards from the international to the regional to the national to the subnational. And by the time you got to parliamentary sovereignty, they would have a very clear idea, perhaps, of just how unimportant it is. It would avoid another problem too. The UK's constitution is, as Dawn has said and Mark has said, a mystery. It is peculiar. But if the first thing that they learn about constitutions is the UK's constitution, it's taken to be the norm. And then there are other systems which are vaguely eccentric, like Spain and the USA, and well, okay, they are all eccentric, but one has to get away from the idea that the only possible meaning, for example, of legislative sovereignty is the rather peculiar meaning that it has in our rather peculiar system. And so if you start out there and then move down, one gets perhaps a proper sense of the rather small place of the UK's constitution in a rather big world. Now, how can one do that? Well, Dawn mentioned the problem that we don't have an idea of the state in our public law, and that certainly seems to be the case. But when you look at it from the outside, you realize that the state is quite an important concept, because states are actors in international law. States have voices in the United Nations. States negotiate with each other within the European Union. It's not something which we can just say is unimportant because we don't have a concept of it. If we were international lawyers rather than public lawyers, we would have a concept. It's a contested concept, but it's there. And so by doing it this way round, one advantage might be that it allows, or would allow, students to get a sense of why the idea of the UK being a state is significant, and why the difference between the UK as a state and, let's say, Scotland as a country or a jurisdiction is also important. Another possibility is that it would demonstrate the limits of the usefulness of what most students regard as the concept of democracy as a normative and analytical tool in relation to constitutions and states. Most of them think that democracy is simply a matter of majority rule. Now, if that is democracy, and you look at what goes on among states at United Nations level, in the WTO, in the EU, it doesn't matter what your focus of attention is, what your example or case study is, one realizes that democracy must mean something else. What is it? Well, trying to do good. It comes back to Dawn's idea of altruism in the public sphere. So we get a sense of why and how the idea of democracy and perhaps even the rule of law are important, and the way in which they're useful. Thirdly, I think it would emphasize how everything has to be negotiated. International law is negotiated. EU law is negotiated. The Constitution of the UK is negotiated. It's a constant process of negotiation and renegotiation between institutions, between parties. And when one sees it in that light, one immediately understands why there are very few right or indeed wrong answers to important questions about our Constitution. It's because they are constantly in the process of renegotiation. And they have to be negotiated in several directions at once, between institutions, between parties, between interest groups, in order to be effective. And lastly, it makes the need to accommodate policy and law to both national and international interests and needs appear to be the norm. It isn't a matter of the UK system of parliamentary representative government and related ideas of democracy. It isn't simply a matter of saying that is the norm. The EU is problematic because there is a democratic deficit. Well, that is not the story. You know, that's only part of it. It's not that the EU is problematic because it's different from the UK. It's that the EU is problematic because it's a forum within which issues have to be debated and resolved in exactly the same way, although in a different institutional setting, as issues have to be debated, negotiated, and resolved in the UK. We are in a world in which people talk, and what we have to get students, I suggest, to understand is that the talking is the game. Thank you.
Many thanks, David. Rodney, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. I've got 8 minutes in order to deal with 3 things in my brief. First, the relationship, as far as teaching is concerned, between constitutional law and administrative law. Secondly, engaging students. And thirdly, the problems caused by large classes. Not many of you will remember the name of Margaret Thatcher's favourite cabinet minister, David Young. Not a household name, possibly, as the joke goes, not even in his own household. Mrs. Thatcher used to trill, "All my ministers bring me problems, David brings me solutions." Alas, I am no David Young. You're going to end up with more problems, questions, and worries than solutions. Anyway, first of all, the relationship between constitutional law and admin law. Since the wide, though not universal, adoption of semesterization and modularization, 2 words that will live in infamy as far as I am concerned, these subjects have been dealt with under the umbrella title of public law. And fair enough, of course, that is entirely sensible. The 2, constitutional and admin, are linked intellectually and practically. But before that merger, if that's the word, usually the 2 were taught separately. Typically, constitutional law would have been taught in the first year, across the whole of the first year, with just enough content within that title, constitutional law, of administrative law to satisfy the professions. 3/4 constitutional, 1/4 admin, or in Manchester's case, perhaps 4/5 to 1/5. But, and this is an important but, administrative law was often, and certainly was at Manchester, offered as an optional subject to be taken if students wished in later years. That pattern was how I was exposed, as it were, to constitutional and administrative law, and how it used to be taught at Manchester. Although, may I say in passing, I did not start my career lecturing in constitutional law. Bizarrely, I started lecturing in criminal law. I've even got some publications to prove it, if anyone's vaguely interested. I'm not in the least. There was a bed blocking case here. Someone had the monopoly of the lectures. What was her name? Brenda Hale. Whatever happened to her? Anyway, however they are taught, I suggest that there are 2 precepts, which is too high-blown a word, as far as constitutional and admin law are concerned. One is, in my view, that constitutional law, however you define it, must be taught, students must be exposed to that before they get to administrative law. I know there are those who say you can do the 2 in tandem, or indeed you can intertwine them more closely. I am strongly against that particular view. constitutional law, after all, however you define it, sets out the basic rules, and broadly speaking, administrative law picks up where constitutional law stops. The other point, of course, is that we as teachers must take account of, and that is the phrase I would use, take account of the requirements of the professions, which still, even though it seems to be watered down somewhat, requires some exposure to administrative law as is customarily understood by the term. Second point that I've been asked to deal with is engaging students. Not all students are engaging, not all students are engaged by constitutional law. The problem is very obvious, and this has been alluded to already, forgive me if I repeat. 18-year-olds typically come to university and are exposed to law about which they may know nothing, or worse than that, they may have been positively misled. Some of them have taken A-level law, nothing wrong with that in principle, but they might have had a rotten curriculum and rotten teachers and think that they know it all. Well, of course, alas, they don't. Students can engage immediately with something like criminal law. After all, they've seen it on television, so they know it must be true and it must be real. Whereas constitutional law, what on earth is that? Well, the solution, of course, is down to us as teachers. It's our job, nobody else's, to explain what constitutional law is, why it's important. There's a problem. Typically, we will advise our students to use a doorstop textbook, regardless of title, and I won't embarrass anyone by mentioning titles. But quite reasonably, as time progresses, perfectly sensible students will say, this is fine, but could you recommend a rather shorter version which deals with these matters in a briefer context? And by the way, could it also include current affairs so that we can pick that up from the book? And while you're at it, could it also include British constitutional history as well? Because we'd find that very useful. Well, I can help them with the first point, if I may say so, breaking my own rule. Peter Leyland's The Constitution of the United Kingdom, in my view, is an excellent book. Not dumbing down what at all, but certainly giving within a reasonable conspectus the basics of constitutional law in the United Kingdom. But as far as current affairs are concerned, as far as British constitutional history are concerned, I know of no textbook or collection of textbooks, and if anyone does, I will have learnt something that has eluded me for years, so please do tell me if you've got some titles up your sleeves. How do we engage students? Well, I have nothing here to help you with. It's a question of, and I'm sure David was exaggerating with the lone gunman, as it were, who purported to say that stuff about his lectures. But in our teaching, there's nothing special, is there, about constitutional law, admin law, or other subjects? It all comes down to the usual cliches, enthusiasm, a mixture of the basics and stretching students. Humour as well, of course, plays its part. Many would say too big a part in my lectures, but there it is. Remind me to tell you about the Duke at Buckingham Palace if there's time later on. It's not relevant. The final issue, I hope I'm still keeping within my 8 minutes, difficulties caused by large classes. Now, when I first saw this, I thought, hang on a minute, this is special pleading. This is not unique to constitutional and administrative law or public law. Contract, criminal law, tort, English legal system, however called, all have the same problem. 200 to 400, nearly 400 in Manchester, students in one room looking at some subject. Why is constitutional law different? Well, there is one additional difficulty, if that's the word, but please, I don't want to paint this in a negative light. There will be many in that 400 who are from other Commonwealth countries or other states, who have no particular British knowledge, no cultural knowledge of the United Kingdom. They haven't been exposed to the mood music, as it were, of living in the United Kingdom. May I stress that the converse is not true. Simply because you are faced with an 18-year-old who was born in Virginia water doesn't mean that he or she will have all these things that I've just alluded to. The remedy, if that's the word, it's not a word I use, is to hold remedial classes. I don't, of course, call them that, but classes to which I invite anybody to come to ask anything at all. And it can be the most basic stuff. What's the difference between a minister and an MP, or Parliament and the government? And I have found that to be, not always, it varies from year to year, quite a large take-up of students, and I stress not only students who have come from overseas jurisdictions. Small group teaching, of course, is a key. That is where I think much work can be done. Small group, by the way, in passing, 1968 when I started, a small group was 5 students. Now at Manchester it's 12, and I think we're still doing well as far in relation to some of our competitors at keeping it that low. But otherwise, the large class problem again reverts to the general cliches, true nonetheless, of teaching. Enthusiasm, question and answer, questions to, questions from, introducing items of news that may be constitutional is always useful if we can, of course. I'm telling you the very obvious. If only in a way to underline the point that defining what is constitutional is not easy. Is it true, by the way, that a United States Supreme Court justice once said, in a pornography case, I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it? Well, I take that view towards constitutional matters, really. It's very difficult to define, but you know it when you see it. And by the way, just one final point on large groups. I personally don't allow slacking. Students in a 400 assume you can't see them. You can. I don't allow people, for example, the other day someone was texting at the back, and I paused and addressed the ceiling and said, I do hope that no one is texting in this class, because that would be very impolite. He went bright red and started to scribble away as though nothing had happened. And also, if someone falls asleep, which they do with monotonous regularity in my lectures, I always make sure I signal to the neighbour to nudge this person and jerks awake. Embarrassing for the person, but I live in fear that someone is actually going to die in one of my lectures. And that the cause of death will be recorded as being lectured by Rodney Brazier. Javier, that's my presentation. I have failed, but there it is.
That's brilliant, Rodney. Thank you very much. And the last contribution of this panel, Robert. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've been tasked with speaking about the challenges and difficulties of public law, and I think the previous speakers have alluded to many of those. I just want to start off briefly by discussing about what is proper and effective teaching and learning itself. And proper and effective teaching, it is hard work, which is very much as it should be. And effective teaching of public law is hard work, but it's immensely worthwhile, important and rewarding. And it's just important to start off with what do we mean by teaching and learning. And what I do not mean is merely the transmission of facts in which students are passive recipients and they're expected to regurgitate those facts in an exam context. That's simply surface learning, which the students dispose of shortly after their exams, and then they go on to the next course. That's what I don't mean. What I do mean by effective teaching and learning is the full engagement of students, making student learning possible, in which teaching and learning should be a collaborative enterprise between lecturers and students. And this is what Alfred Whitehead once described as the proper function of a university. It's about the imaginative acquisition of knowledge. It involves making the area of study intellectually challenging and intriguing. Students get involved in the learning process. Their enthusiasm is sparked and their curiosity about the subject grows. And it's about working with students to help them learn and change their understanding. And in the public law context, it involves enabling students to think like public lawyers. And we need to think, well, what does that actually mean? What is thinking like, getting students to think as public lawyers? What does it mean in practice? What do we expect of students at the end, of, for instance, of the first year of their undergraduate degree? So some of the generic challenges have been alluded to already. And one, as Rodney has just mentioned, is about the volume of students, about how we go about teaching them, the particular learning techniques and mechanisms that we use. And it's not just about the acquisition of knowledge, of course, it's also about students developing their key legal skills that will help them in other courses, their analytical skills, analysing the law, situating it within its broader, wider social and political context, enabling students to develop their research skills, their oral presentation skills, and how they apply the law. And there may, of course, be some lack of familiarity on the behalf of some students with public law. And as has previously been mentioned, we have students coming from overseas, from other constitutional traditions, who may find the UK's constitutional arrangements slightly unusual and bemusing. There's also changing student attitudes and behaviours, and students are very results focused. They're acutely conscious of the wider position out there in the real world as regards employability for law graduates and competition for jobs. And students are more demanding nowadays. They're after all, they're investing quite a considerable sum of money in their education. There are other changes with student behaviour. They're very much technology aware, and they expect us to engage in e-learning and the use of technology for effective learning. We've got to think about, well, how do we use e-learning effectively? The good news within institutions is that the focus on teaching has increased. There's more of a focus on university teaching nowadays, and with increased competition for students between law schools, that means that the quality of the student experience is now imperative. So it's within this particular context that I'm going to look at some of the challenges for teaching of public law. And I think really one of the big challenges is simply, well, how do you manage the material? Public law is far dynamic and fast changing. We've got to cover the nuts and bolts of the subject matter, but we also need to provide context. We may also want to provide interdisciplinary linkages. We want to give students a flavour of the wider scholarly and theoretical debates. After all, public law is a topic where there's very little agreement over the nature of the discipline. And we also want to engage in research-led teaching. And picking up on a couple of things that were said by Dawn and David, one of the tasks is about engaging students effectively and making them realise, well, just the sheer importance of public law to how the country is governed, and relating the formal construct of the Constitution based on principles such as sovereignty, separation of powers, and so on, relating that to the current reality, the what really happens Constitution. How does government work? How is it truly held to account? How do accountability structures operate in practice? So, on the one hand, you've got the formal Constitution. On the other hand, you've got the what really happens Constitution. How is political power actually exercised? And from my experience, the most effective way of doing this is through carefully selected case studies of how governments are held to account, the structures, institutions, and so on, rather than just going through, all of the formal structure of the Constitution, to look at how particular contexts of the Constitution operate in practice and to relate theoretical and practical aspects of it. Another issue that I as an administrative lawyer, I have quite a concern about is, well, how do you structure public law within a year-long course where there might be a tendency to focus more on general constitutional law issues, and there's always a risk that constitutional law takes the predominance of the course, and there's about a quarter to a third of the course on administrative law. The particular concern I've got here in terms of course design is that the risk is that administrative law gets sidelined and it's just seen and interpreted as the principles of judicial review and relatively little else. I think there's a concern there in terms of how much significance is given to administrative law, how it's interpreted. And underlying this, there's a broader issue about, well, which conception of law are we trying to get across to students? What is the underlying concept of law that we're trying to get across? Is law solely about controlling and curbing governmental power? Or in practice, is law used as a means of implementing and putting policy into practice? And I think there's a risk with focusing too little on the wider context of administrative law. The two other aspects I've been asked to discuss are when should public law be taught in the curriculum, first year, second year, or third year, and the place of other subjects in the curriculum under the public law umbrella. I think there's pretty much a common pattern in that public law is taught, you have a generic public law course in the first year that all students must do, and it's part of their qualifying law degree, and then there are optional courses in the second and third year. Particularly important optional course might be human rights. At Manchester we have constitutional law, but then there's a whole range of other public law courses that might be taught, such as social security law, planning and environmental law, and public law can also be extended to include aspects of regulation, regulation of financial markets, regulation of the media, and so on. And I think that there's a need here to consider how the undergraduate degree is organised as a whole, and whether the public law themes that start off in the first year are carried through into the second and third year, and public law doesn't become hived off into its own specialist components. So there's an issue there in terms of curriculum design. The other point, I find this quite an omission in terms of how we teach public law, which is the study of legislation and just how crucial legislation is as a form of law. After all, it is our predominant form of law. And where does the study of legislation come into play? After all, most legislation is public law. It's administrative law, law enacted in order to implement public policy programs. So there are issues there in terms of overall curriculum design, the need to think about progression throughout the undergraduate degree. So these are some points that I think are very important to bear in mind. First of all, both public law teaching and also scholarship, it needs to be continually nourished by the realities of how political and governmental power is exercised. There's a constant need to keep public law in touch with the reality of political and governmental practices. Second point, that no one size does not fit all. There's no ideal set curriculum for public law. There's no single model. Each lecturer, each teacher will have their own interests, their own way of designing it. They want to incorporate their own research-led teaching. The third point is this. I think we need to think very carefully about designing courses, in particular our aims, objectives, and learning outcomes, and about how these aims, objectives underpin the entirety of the course and how they're reflected in assessment procedures. Another point is we have to think in terms of what are the main themes we want to get across to students in terms of the institutions of the state and their organisation, substantive themes such as governmental legitimacy, legal and political modes of constitutionalism, accountability, and the multi-layered constitution. That sounds an awful lot to fit in, and to think, how are these themes going to be explored in practice? And there's always a risk with public law, at least I find there's a risk, and I'm speaking as much to myself. There's always a temptation to add more and more content. There's always a new case, there's always a new development or so on. And this is a temptation that really should be resisted. It's always better to include less material and ensure that students learn that smaller part properly. A couple of final points. It's always important to take student feedback seriously. Students are uniquely well placed to comment on their teaching. And I put myself along with David as someone who's received highly critical comments. Just recently, a student said, well, I don't understand why I'm being taught this course at all. So it's always important to take student feedback seriously and to talk to students about what works for them. Finally, I end with a plea for diversity and experimentation. There's no single best approach. We need a diversity of approaches to teaching public law. We need to be willing to experiment, to take risks, and if we fail, we have to learn from that and with a view to improving for the future.
Thank you, Robert. I would like to thank our 4 speakers for their very thorough, illuminating, engaging. I think we got engaged in these presentations, and very thought-provoking. And if I may, we have approximately 35 minutes for question and answer. But I would like, if at all possible, to avoid some overlaps, which to an extent are inevitable with the second and the third session. We tried to make them as self-contained as possible, but understandably the first session touches upon some of the areas that will be covered in the second session, particularly the methods of teaching and assessing public law, and also the third session, which is the relationship between teaching and research. Then if I may ask you questions concerning methodology of teaching, could we discuss that in the second slot, because that will be the natural scope or place of that area. However, I think there have been loads of issues that have been rightly raised by our 4 very distinguished speakers, and I'm going to list them. And what I would like, we would be very grateful if colleagues introduce themselves the first time when they take part in this conference. And I'm most grateful to Mark, one of our colleagues who has kindly agreed to help us out with a microphone, because we have to pass it around in the next few minutes. Then I know that Don had sent out about it, but the nature of public law is one topic that has been dealt with. The general challenges ahead of us, generally speaking, the interdisciplinary nature of our subject, the constitutional administrative law dichotomy. Is it true that administrative law in some of our institutions is not perhaps taken so seriously as constitutional law, and we just struggle to teach both of them? That would be an interesting area to discuss. The national and European and international dimension that has been dealt with by David. Also an interesting area that sometimes those of us who don't do research on mainstream public law, whatever that means, sometimes we try to justify ourselves. We are public lawyers despite the fact that we do research on areas such as law and religion, and some of the speakers have mentioned that before. That would be interesting. Robert has alluded to that. Another area, when should public law be taught? Well, I think that's quite a lot, actually. Then, first of all, I would like to invite our speakers if they want to add something to this contribution, or otherwise, I think it would be brilliant to hear from you from this moment onwards. Thank you. Richard?
Okay. Richard Kirkham, University of Sheffield. Thanks, that was great. I believe everything that I've just heard. Robert, you asked that question right at the end, your student saying something about why are we being taught this course. I've just been handed the poison chalice of curriculum review at my university. And one thing they didn't ask, he said where public law should be taught, but how much of the darn stuff should be being taught? And why are we trying to force so much of it? In my university, 40 credits. Why are we forcing so much of it down the throats of a proportion of students who don't get it, who don't want to get it? So, well, the question is, how much public law do you think we should be teaching? How much do we need to do this? Obviously, we need to do some because it's in the QLD, but if we're not told how much, or to what extent we should delve into the issues.
I think you know, for your first year course, you have to cover the basics. You have to explain what is a constitution, how it operates, the aspects of it. But in terms of how much, I mean, you know, you can have a 40 credit course, but you know, how much actual materials, it's the decision for each individual academic in terms of, you know, how the course is structured. I think the risk is about putting in too much material, but you know, where do you draw the line? I mean, we can make that judgment as lecturers about, you know, how much is too much. You can't cover everything, can you? Or you can raise core issues, but you know, how much detail do you explore them in? I mean, you can cover, say, for instance, devolution, but that's potentially like a massive topic, and in some parts of the UK it might receive more coverage and more detail than others. Yeah, I think you have that. You've got, it's a question of like selling the nature of the discipline to the students, getting them engaged, getting them fired up, making them intellectually curious. I mean, as I said, most students arrive with a good idea of what law is. Law is about courts, law is about the criminal law, it's about police. The whole notion of constitutional law is something that many students will not have encountered. So it's about ensuring, I mean, that's advantageous. It's about ensuring that their first engagement with the discipline is exciting, fires them up, and then having a reasonable range, a good range of optional courses that they can explore it in more depth.
Can I add a word? I mean, I think from my point of view, how much, the answer is about this much. And that is at least the minimum. How much more than that depends on how many public lawyers you've got on your staff and how much weight they have in the departmental politics of negotiation, because just like constitutions, curricula have to be negotiated. And that might make a rather nice case study. Now, the real problem with this is not so much how much, but, and I think this is what Rob was saying, what? And when I started studying the subject, which in my day was called constitutional law, and it's still called constitutional law, though in a different place, it was very much a mixture of basic constitutional ideas, a very small amount of judicial review. There wasn't much of it about in those days, and quite a lot of what were called in those days civil liberties, including police powers. Now, fashions change, and so it's all a matter of doing what's fashionable at the time, because everyone wants to be fashionable. But I think the important thing is that you know why you're doing whatever it is that you're doing, rather than there is an irreducible minimum or an absolute maximum.
Yes, can I take that up? Why do it at all? Now, what I'm going to say isn't about public law, I'll get back to that, but a few years ago we were having a curriculum review. We've got, at UCL, we've got quite a lot of students who are not going to practice either at all, or else they're certainly not going to practice in the United Kingdom. So, you know, Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia, and then France and Germany. So when we were having this review, I said, well, unless a student wants a qualifying law degree, why should we expect them to do land law? Well, I mean, English land law is no use to anybody outside England, I think, really, and Wales. It might be a bit useful in Ireland. But, oh, shock, horror. Do you mean we could possibly give someone a thing called an LLB when they hadn't done English land law? Now, turning the question round, and forget a moment that obviously if they're doing the qualifying law degree, they've got to do a certain amount of public law. Why would you put public law, or would you put public law, in an LLB for students from, wherever, France, Germany, etc., Hong Kong, and if so, why would you put it there? Not just because that's what the professions want. I'm asking the question, I haven't got an answer.
Sorry, Robbie,
Yeah.
and then Nick.
Thanks very much. So Ruby Ziegler and Reading. It actually relates to some extent to the question you were just flagging up. And, thanks very much. And goes back to what I found quite intriguing and tend to agree with sort of David's description of the international going into the regional, going into the specific. I think that answers to some extent the question of why you'd want to teach it, perhaps to identify the wider concepts that are in common between different states, and to start from the concept of the state. So to my mind, and that sort of relates also to the point about when to teach. What I find interesting, that's sort of coming from being a public international lawyer in many ways, is that public international law, of course, is not a core subject in nearly all universities, right? And if it is taught, it's taught much later, right? After constitutional law and administrative law. And so the question sort of, to my mind, logically following from what David said, is that shouldn't there be a component, perhaps a very basic introduction of public international law, the concept of the state, the concept of the individual vis-a-vis the state within that context, at the start of any public law analysis? Thank you.
Shall I answer that? I'll have a go at that. I agree, but I don't think it needs to be public international law. I'm not a public international lawyer any more than an EU lawyer, or some would say any sort of lawyer. But the point is that what you need to do early on is get the idea across that there is a world out there, and that the UK is just part of it. And the world organises itself in ways that we have to fit into and work within and work with. And so I don't know that it's necessary myself to have an element of public international law as such. But I do think what's important is that they start with the idea that there is a world.
If I could just add one thought to that. We've all seen curriculum reviews, and they come along like buses, it seems. But I thought for many years, and this will make our discussions today in many senses more difficult, I am surprised that we can produce someone, taking up Dawn's point, with a LLB degree, someone who has not studied public international law. I think the case for this has got stronger as recent decades have passed. Now, I'm not suggesting it should all be crammed into the first year or crammed into a sort of super public law course, but I remain strongly of the view, though in a hopeless minority, that in an ideal curriculum, there is no such thing, public international law would, in one form or another, be taught as a compulsory subject, for the reasons that David is giving.
Nick.
Generally speaking, it's inhumane to detain a fleeting insight. But I wanted to reply to, I think, Dawn, what Dawn said when she asked, why should we teach public law? And it seems to me, I'm sure I'm speaking to the converted, that public law is extremely important, but also that it is distinctive to private law, and that it's really important that a law degree would equip our students both with the public law bit and the private law bit together. And public law is important because it's an aspect of the construction of the state. So it's universally important to understand how public law works and what the key features of public law are. If you're teaching a student from Malaysia or Hong Kong or China, they need to understand public law, perhaps even more than they need to understand contract and tort. Administrative law, extremely interesting. It connects in the British realm into our hidden understanding of what the state is, the idea that the state should behave in a rational way. I think that's key to administrative law. And in your presentation, Dawn, you talked about you weren't sure of the significance of the public-private divide, but I think this is crucial and really exciting and interesting. So on the one hand, we do see public law ideas entering into the realm that was previously occupied by the armies of the private lawyers. But we might have two responses to this. One response might be, this is very dangerous. This is very dangerous. This is forcing people to behave in the private sphere in a state-like, public law-like way. And this significantly impinges on how private citizens can act. But the other side of this is, it could be a very positive thing in that it's a recognition that private power contains state-like features which should lead to a state-like reaction by the law to private power. So I do think there is a sharp divide between public and private law, but I do also think that public law principles transfer into the private realm when private entities are behaving in a state-like way. So that's why all of our students must be taught public law, both because it's half of what a law degree should be about, but also because you probably can't understand private law without understanding public law's encroachment.
Well, I think one could have a conference on that probably, but don't let's. Now, I'm not disagreeing. I was asking the question because I think we all need to think, why bother anyway. But, I mean, you make the point that public law is creeping into private law. Well, actually, a lot of public law comes from private law, if you want to make the distinction. I mean, the Wednesbury case was decided by Lord Green, who was a corporate lawyer, and he was bringing doctrines from equity and from company law into judicial review. So, I mean, that would perhaps illustrate why I think it's very difficult to sort of sharply divide the two. But anyway, let's distract ourselves.
And Lion there.
I'm Lion from Plymouth. Yes. First of all, an apology, an observation to Rodney. I have written a book on constitutional history.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Obviously, Rodney prefers not to recommend it to his students. Probably speaks volumes for my writing on the subject.
But it's not in the same slim volume that covers all three things that I was mentioning. That's the problem.
Right, yeah. So what you need is one slim volume to cover everything rather than a slim volume covering one topic.
This is what students want, yes.
I see.
And they can't have.
Right. Now, to get back to what I was about to say, the reason I would say why students from other jurisdictions need to study public law is that the basic principles of public law, including such things as separation of powers, rule of law, and so on, can be carried over to a great extent to other jurisdictions, in particular other written constitutions. After all, the American Constitution is the perfect embodiment of separation of powers, and having acquired the, if you like, mental equipment gained by studying British public law, you can then take it on to, let us say, Malaysian or Chinese public law. Because let us face it, and what is often forgotten, is that a degree course is not just the acquisition of knowledge, it's a training for the mind, which unfortunately successive governments seem largely to have forgotten. And before I perorate any longer, I'll hand over the microphone and somebody else can take over.
May I comment on that? Because that's absolutely right. And it's also very entertaining for those students from elsewhere. Occasionally I have to speak to law students from places abroad, and they, as I try to explain the basics of the UK's constitution, I can see their faces, first of all, becoming disbelieving, and then becoming very amused. And they don't think I'm telling the truth, and at the end, it's as if I've given them the sort of eighth volume of the Harry Potter series. It has the same sort of impact on their minds. This is just weird, How do you survive? And so I think it's useful for them in terms of stretching their capacity to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast.
So, any comments from the panel? No? Okay, then, sorry, this gentleman here. Mark.
I'm Michael Phillis from the Australian National University. I'm not sure to what extent this overlaps with the second panel, but if you agree that constitutional law has expanded in teaching at the expense of administrative law, has that been driven by legal developments or fashion in research or something else?
Well, I mean, I think there is a lot more constitutional law here than there used to be. I mean, we've got the devolution legislation, we've got the Human Rights Act, we've got Freedom of Information, and then we've got the Localism Act and all sorts of other stuff. So I think if we count those as constitutional rather than admin law subjects, there's just more of it, and it's more statute-based. So I would have thought that must be one of the reasons why it's taught more.
Robert?
I think that's right. I mean, what we might be experiencing is like the constitutionalisation of administrative law, in that, previously, your average judicial review is now a human rights challenge. It raises issues about, governmental legitimacy, sovereignty, and so on. Nonetheless, there's still a substantial amount of developments in administrative law, and perhaps there's been a fashion here of scholarly interest towards general constitutional issues.
I think there's in the United Kingdom anyway, a historical reason as well, that we need to remember that what we know as administrative law is a relatively recent invention, at least as a label. You can trace it back, say, to the 1950s, by bringing together disparate matters under one title, as it were. But before that, of course, constitutional law had been there forever. And so there is a sort of historical piece of baggage, if you like to put it that way, which explains why the focus has been mainly on constitutional law, and then only latterly, 50, 60 years ago, developing in administrative law, which of course greatly expanded through the courts from the 1960s onwards. So I think that partly explains why we are or were where we were. The question is where you go from here today.
I just was prompted by what Robert said to wonder whether the average judicial review case is now a human rights challenge. If that's true, then it seems both counterintuitive and potentially disastrous. There must be loads and loads of these things that aren't there?
Well, I mean, there's obviously the high-profile issues which are human rights related. I think a couple of other points to that. I mean, what we're experiencing in the UK is the expansion of judicial review outside the courts as well, because a substantial amount of the JL work is going over to tribunals. I think there's the other issue. What are we thinking of when we're teaching students? What type of lawyers are they going to become? Because we tend to have it in our mind that they're going to be practitioners out there. But of course, law is not just for lawyers, and government itself uses law, and the vast majority of the rules, regulations, and so on, administrative law in that sense, is within government itself, where law is not used to control policy, it's a function of policy.
Thank you. Jen?
Hi, Jane Norton from the University of Birmingham. I had 2 points that I wanted to make. The first was just a response to Professor Oliver's point about the importance of acknowledging the interdisciplinary nature of public law. I think coming as an outsider to the UK, one of the weaknesses of the LLB here is that students don't do conjoint degrees with other disciplines. So in New Zealand, for example, I did a politics degree alongside my law degree, and in the United States it's a graduate degree. So I think that's one of the weaknesses in this country in terms of being able to have interdisciplinary work. The second point I wanted to make was a response to Professor Brazier's comment about being unable to find a textbook that deals with current developments in constitutional law.
I have my pen ready.
Sorry, and so my immediate response was, well, I would direct them towards certain blogs, and so maybe this is a topic for another session, but what are your thoughts on using blogs as a way to draw students' attention to current issues in public law? And those are my 2 points. Thanks.
Yes, well, thank you for your point about most of our students doing only law. I mean, we have, we are very unfortunate because the normal law degree is a 3-year degree. And obviously 1 or 2 places teach 4 years, which might be 1 year of foreign law or whatever. But I mean, so we have to cram, we feel we have to cram into 3 years all the stuff which the qualifying law degree requires, plus as much as possible of the other stuff we want to do, like public international law or jurisprudence or whatever. And I think that's why there's a problem in deciding how much you can and can't put in public law, let alone the other subjects.
Well, just to say that I'm all in favour of using, for example, blogs, but of course we've got to be very, very careful. There's some excellent stuff, but that is overwhelmed by complete rubbish. So it's somehow not directing, but guiding people to useful sources. I'm sure we've all come across the footnotes in essays that give us authority for some proposition, Wikipedia. Someone told me the other day, do you know you're in Wikipedia? And I Googled in and saw that I was in Wikipedia. I have no idea how I got in there, but I happened to notice, showing the uselessness of this thing, happened to notice some factual mistakes, which I edited, and they are now on Wikipedia, just to prove what a dangerous tool that can be. So blogs, yes, but with some degree of caution, I think.
But I think we should put in a word for the Constitutional Law Group blog, which Nick runs, which I think is a fantastic resource, really. Very, absolutely excellent.
Further thoughts? Andrew? We only have like 5 minutes left, but...
Thank you. Andrew Lesworth from Queen Mary. I wonder if the panel agree with me that we're all rather too conservative when it comes to curriculum design. I was very taken by ideas that Dawn put forward about incorporating behavioural science, and I really like David's idea about perhaps starting at the international level and digging down, but we don't do that. And one of the salutary experiences I had was working with OUP on a text cases and materials book, where we did some really quite good market research, asking people whether they would want to see more international material incorporated into a constitutional law book, and the answer that came back was no. And it's very difficult to write a book or edit a book that is going to sell if you do anything out of the ordinary. I wonder whether the panel agree that that's a problem.
It is a problem. I agree with Andrew about that. And I think that it's linked to another problem, which is that there's a good deal of market research that's fed to people who write books. It seems to me that in the days when this happens, we then are expected to write to the prescription set out in the focus group or the market research, and the business of writing books then becomes too much like politics. Whereas in the days before all this market research, or anyway before it was fed to authors, one wrote the book that one thought was needed, and then people decided whether to make use of it. And certainly, I don't think I would ever have written anything had it been led by a piece of market research. So I think it's partly that we collectively as academics tend to be conservative, but I think also there's an increasing problem that books tend to be customer-driven rather than author-driven.
Fiona?
Thanks, Fiona Johnson from University College Cork, but obviously originally from around here. And I want to talk a little bit about comparative and bringing in other jurisdictions, because it's quite interesting being an English woman in Ireland and teaching. I don't teach constitutional law, and one of the things is I don't understand the Irish Constitution. And I actually tell my students that, because I think one of the things about constitutional law is that it's actually quite personal. That I grew up with the unwritten constitution. I get it. My students come and ask me, I've been told there's no constitution in England. Is that true? And I have to sit them down and explain to them that it's different, and they have the whole Harry Potter glaze eyes. This is just insane. So that's one thing. And I teach administrative law, and I have to use quite a lot of English and Welsh material, but I also use Canadian and Australian. And I think in a jurisdiction like Ireland, we use quite a lot of comparative material because, well, for a number of reasons. We use a lot of British stuff because of the history, and trying to teach them about the history of the parliamentary system and British history to a group of Irish students has many difficult elements to it, not least because they tend to look at me and go, well, you're English, so you're teaching me this because you're English. And I have to try and explain to them that there is actually a good reason for understanding that history and then overlaying the Irish history on top. The other thing is that you have to teach the other jurisdictions because we don't have the same degree of case law and we don't have the same degree of development yet. So it's a real tension there, but it's also a joy, and I think it's quite interesting. I'm actually really enjoying sitting here listening to how I used to teach it and think about how I teach now, that it's actually a real pleasure to be able to bring in other jurisdictions and to talk about other systems and actually get a positive student feedback in terms of that's actually really positive to know what's happening in Australia or Canada or across the water in Britain. So I would certainly kind of say a positive encouragement to probably more comparative and a more openness, because when I think back to how I taught here, it was actually very closed. In Britain, there is a real closed nature to how public law is taught. I don't know. That's more of a statement, and I'm sorry, but I think there's a question there as well in terms of what you think in relation to it.
Yes, I agree with that. I can see how it is very closed, and we need more focus on what happens elsewhere. And part of the challenge with writing a textbook is precisely that. What degree of comparison? How do you fit it within your word limit? What about the people who want the chapter on police powers, for instance, or whatever? What I'd just say is, look, textbooks have their place, and students like them. They're the comfort blanket. But come on, I mean, we shouldn't be restricted by textbooks. I mean, it's useful. It's there on the reading list, but it's your course. Teach it how you want to do it.
And I think it's an important issue that has been raised. Are we far too conservative and we're not brave enough to try to touch upon other disciplines? And I was going to ask Don, who dealt commendably with the disciplinarity of public law. Did you incorporate any elements of anthropology or evolutionary psychology in your first year teaching? Did you ever try?
By the time I wrote something about it, I'd stopped teaching the first years, and I don't think they would have listened, actually, to be honest. It's probably for advanced. But, I mean, I think this thing about material is important, and I do think comparisons are extremely helpful. And of course, we need to remember that books aren't the only source of material you can try to get students to read. So if there are articles in either law journals or whatever it is, politics journals and so on, that's a good source. Because you really can't expect students to read a whole book or even get a book out of the library, especially if there's only one copy and there are 200 students. So I think articles, chapters and so on, and distribute them to students or put them on the website or something, is a way of trying to get them to read a bit of comparative or interdisciplinary work.
Excellent. Well, I would like to thank once again our four excellent speakers for an extremely enjoyable, thoroughly enjoyable session. We very much, well, I would like to invite you all now to join us for lunch that is going to be held on the first floor. And I think you have a variety of options there, vegetarian, fish, or meat. And well, and I look forward to... The other thing is, I've been informed that if you wish, you're welcome to leave cases here. I'll leave the last, and I'll make sure that the door is properly locked. And well, enjoy your lunch, and thank you very much once again.